Alright, hey everyone. I'm going to give a brief tutorial just on the basics of importing your files from your SD cards, from your camera, and doing some brief edits and then exporting all of your files out. So the first thing I do before I'm even going to go into any programs is I need to make sure I have a place to put my files on the desktop. So I am going to just right click over on my desktop somewhere and hit new or new folder. And then I'm going to rename that folder. It can be my initials, and then I could call it digital photos or digital photography, whatever you want. And then inside of that new folder, I'm going to make another new folder. I just hit Control-Shift-N to make a new folder. And then I'm going to call that landscape in class photos. Or whatever the current project that you're going to be working on is, and then hit enter there. So now I'm ready to start putting my photos from my SD card into here. I want to make sure I'm not working off of photos that are on my SD card. I want to get them off the SD card first, and then I can just transfer them into my desktop to edit them from there. So now I'm going to plug in my SD card. And there it is, it pops up. Most of the time, you're going to find your photos in the DCIM folder, but this next part I actually want to do inside of Bridge. A handy tip, if you find where your photos are, so here in this case, this is the big folder with all my photos, I'm going to click up here on the bar, and then right click and copy that address. Then I'm going to open up Bridge. And inside of Bridge, if you click up on this top area, you can input that address that you just copied. So I can right click and hit paste and then hit enter, and it will automatically open up that file location. Otherwise, you could go to desktop, or you could go to this PC in whatever way you need to find your SD card location. But I'm just going to copy and paste that web address in. Okay, and now that I see all my files that are on my SD card, I'm going to start labeling and selecting through the ones that I want. Here's a panorama that I shot. If I hold Shift, I can just select all of those that are in the series of panorama shots. And what I want to start doing now is labeling the photos that I want to keep and add onto my desktop to start editing. The way that you do that is you hold Control or Command on a Mac, and then you press one of the number buttons 6 through 9. So here I'll select this first one, and I will hold Control and hit 6, and it'll give me a red label. If I hit 7, it'll do yellow, 8 is green, and 9 is blue. It's really handy to have multiple labels, because pretty often you are going to have multiple, sets of images, and you may want to label them separately. Like you can see up here, previously I had labeled a bunch of these blue, so I'm not going to use that one. I'm going to select green because I'm a fan of green, so I'm going to make those Control 8 to select them as green. And you'll see why that's a good idea to do in a second. I'm going to select all these panoramas, so now all 4 of these are selected, and I can label those as well. Let me just pick out a few others that I like. Alright, so now I have my panorama and then 3 other photos that I want to try and edit. And the real handy thing about labeling is over here on the left panel under Filter, you can now just select those green labels that we made, which is really great. So now I want to transfer these off of my SD card and onto that folder that we made at the beginning. So I'm going to select all of them, holding Shift, and then I'm going to copy those. And then I'm going to go back to my desktop up on the top navigator and find my way to the folder we just made. And then I'm going to paste those in, and it will do everything for me and copy those files right there. Next thing I want to do is actually eject and unplug my SD card, which I just did now, so that I know that I'm not working from those files. I know that I'm just working using the files that we just transferred onto our desktop. Let's look at a quick, cool feature that is available within Camera Raw. Here I've been working in Bridge, and I also have Photoshop open, ready to go. But if you want to open things in Camera Raw, if you shot in RAW, like a DNG or a RAW file or some other format that isn't JPEG for the most part, you'll just open it up in Camera Raw immediately. If you want to open up JPEGs or any other images in Camera Raw with Photoshop, all you have to do from within Bridge is select all of those files. In this case, I'm just going to be working on the panorama, and then I'm going to right click, and the third one down is open in Camera Raw. So I'm going to click on that, and now all of my panorama images are going to be opened up in Camera Raw. The first thing I want to do is see if I can do a optics like profile lens correction. Here on the right panel of Camera Raw, you'll see all of these different options. Let me make this window a little bit bigger. And under optics, which is the 6th row down, you will see a little checkbox that says use profile correction. So if I click that, Photoshop is going to try and automatically read what lens and what camera I was using. I actually need to switch. Oh, nope, it already has it. And you can see what it does is it'll help get rid of any distortion, and it'll also help to get rid of any vignetting that may be affecting your lens. In this case, I'm just going to turn down the vignette a tiny bit so that it's just correcting that a little bit. If you don't have the lens option or camera model available, don't really worry about it. It shouldn't affect anything too much, but if you have the option to get rid of a little distortion or vignetting, it might help you out in some editing situations. Next, I don't want to do any edits at all. Important thing to note, within Camera Raw, you can select. You see down at the bottom, I'm just selecting single images, which is not always the best way to do things because you may want to make universal edits across all of those images. So before you make any edits, select all of your files in there, and that way anything you change will automatically show that change across all of the files you have selected. If you are inside of Camera Raw and you're messing with a bunch of sliders and you kind of just want to reset, just double click on the little dot on the slider and it will automatically reset it back to the middle neutral position. Anyway, to combine a panorama inside of Camera Raw, just select all of the images inside of your panorama and then right click on them and click Merge to Panorama. And it'll take a second. It's going to do its, processing and thinking. Cylindrical. I kind of like the way that cylindrical looks. I think it gives a little less distortion to the building here. Very nice. Boundary warp is another thing we can adjust a little bit, which I'm going to move it all the way over to 100. I think that helps get rid of a little distortion. Next, we have auto crop, which we can turn on and off. I like to keep it on just so that it has a nice, clean, crisp, square edge. And finally, we want to uncheck Apply Auto Settings. You can see that it does kind of do a nice job with some of the editing, but I want to be making those editing choices myself, so I'm going to uncheck that. Then I will just hit Merge. Now it will give me the option to save. It automatically will name the file for the first image that we put in, and then it'll add Pano on the end, which is totally fine. And then I'm going to hit Save on that. It's going to do its final work, and then it's going to give us our very nice new panoramic file already done. I'm going to hit Cancel in Camera Raw and go back to Bridge for a second. And you can see that within our folder, we now have this new panorama image to work with, which is very nice. Next, let's open up our 3 other images. and I'm just going to select them and double click, and they will automatically open in Camera Raw because they are DNG files. If you're using JPEGs, they will just open up directly into Photoshop, which is totally fine. Within Camera Raw, I'm going to first select all 3 of my images so that I'm editing all 3 of them at once. I'm going to do just the little automatic profile correction and maybe lower the vignette a tiny bit so that it's just getting rid of a little bit of vignetting. Next, I'm going to go into the basic drop-down menu. Here I can select a new white balance. You can't go too far with it, but you have a lot of leeway to correct any white balance issues you might have had. I'm just going to cool it down a tiny bit. That looks good. Next, we have exposure, which we can move up and down. I try not to mess with this too much because hopefully I shot my image and exposed it well in the first place. I do like to turn the contrast slider pretty far down just to give myself more information to work with inside of Photoshop instead of here in Camera Raw. The highlights, you can see they get highlighted in red up here in this little section. So I can turn those down just to get them back from being overexposed. Shadows, I try not to mess with too much, but if you want to make them a little brighter or a little darker, you can do that. Try to make these edits pretty subtle. We're trying to do most of the work within Photoshop and not here in Camera Raw. And yeah, these all look good. I'm going to click through the rest of them, just make sure there are no glaring exposure issues or anything. Then I will select all of them. So now all 3 of them are selected. The way you can tell is it has a little kind of, the one we're actually looking at is highlighted in a white box. And then when we hold shift and select the others, they kind of get a little gray outline around them. And then I will hit open right here, and that will open all 3 of those files inside of Photoshop. Now our files are loaded up into Photoshop, and there are 3 different layers that we want to make adjustments to. So a brief overview of Photoshop. Down here on the right, you have your layers, which are very important. Our main photo is always going to be our background. And you'll also see this little eye tool, which we can click on, and it will turn our layers on and off as we add them. If I double click here, I can change it from a background to a layer, and then you can see I can turn it on and off, which just gets rid of the image completely. The first thing we want to add is a levels layer. So I'm going to go up to layer up here at the top, click on that, and then I'm going to select new adjustment layer, and then I'm going to select levels. Levels is a tool that we can use to adjust how bright or dark things are and kind of adjust the contrast and exposure of our image. I'm going to drag this window out from here. It may pop up in here. I'm just going to drag it out so it's a little bigger. And this little graph is called a histogram. It shows us what all of the information and pixels of our photo are as far as brightness. So this little dark part down here is going to be that little MSC logo. And this little pinpoint on the left is where the pure black point of our photo is. So as I drag this across, you can see that more and more of our image becomes pure black because I'm telling Photoshop that I want everything to the left of this slider to be pure black. And likewise, all the way on the right side, it will adjust the pure white slider. So Photoshop is going to say, hey, everything on the right side of this pure white slider, I want to look pure white in my image. Basically, it allows us to adjust the highlights and the shadow portions of our image. And we are going to use these 2 sliders in addition to the mid-range slider, which kind of brightens or darkens all of the midtones. We're going to use that to pretty much adjust our final contrast. The easiest way to do that, I find, is to take the middle slider, slide it pretty far over to the right, not all the way, but pretty far, and then grab the highlight slider. And now we can see like very, very accurately when we are reaching pure white, especially in the sky here. So I don't want it to be too overexposed. So I am going to adjust it maybe to there. I'm kind of cutting off a little bit of information here. You can see when I pull it back that we start to lose a little bit of this. So I'm just going to set this pinpoint right at the edge of where the information starts. That looks pretty good. Next, let's do the same thing. Let's drag that midtone slider over toward the shadows. And now we can see a real accurate view of when pure black starts to happen in our image. I want to stop just before things become really pure black. We're getting a little bit down here underneath of the hose. So I'm probably going to stop around here. We can see it start to creep into that logo. So I'm going to go about there. Next, we can move the slider back to 1, right in the middle, and just see what it looks like. I may want to pull back those shadows a touch. And now we can just adjust the midtones to taste. I try not to go, below plus or minus 20. So from 1, I try not to go above 1.2, and I try not to go below 0.8. But if you go a little bit further, a little bit past, it should be okay. I'm going to darken the midtones in this instance just a little bit. Probably go around there. And I think that looks pretty good. We can go over here to this eye tool, and we can just click it on and off to show our change before and after. And I'm pretty happy with this as it is. Next, let us add a new adjustment layer. So we make sure it is layer, new adjustment layer, and then color balance. We're going to hit OK because I'm all right for it to be named color balance. And this is the color balance tool. There are a couple things. This is our just main color balance. We can adjust toward cyan and red. We can adjust toward magenta and green. And we can adjust toward yellow and blue. And we can also just click over here and reset those numbers back to 0, which will put us back in the center. Another important note is that we can also adjust the shadows and the highlights of our image. The midtones is probably where the most, noticeable adjustments are going to happen. But adjusting the shadows and the highlights as well can sometimes be necessary. Our goal is to just make a very neutral looking image. We're not trying to do any crazy color shifts or anything like that. We just want to make very minor tweaks. In this instance, I kind of want to warm it up a little bit. So I'm going to go a couple points toward red, maybe a couple points toward yellow. And then I'm going to see if there needs to be any hue adjustment. I might just go toward the negative a little bit. I'm going to take a look at the shadows. We can see the shadows make very kind of deep overall adjustments to the darker parts of the image. I might, let's see, just make tiny little adjustments. I am going pretty fast here. This is where I like to take a lot of time. I'm pretty happy with that. Next, let's look at highlights. I try not to move the highlights too much because you can see it kind of really shifts the color of your image a lot, like up here in the sky and the bright parts. It doesn't always look that great to adjust, but if I wanted to warm up this image a tiny bit, I could move them a little toward the yellow and a little toward the red. Now, let's uncheck it and see what we did. That looks pretty good. I was noticing like kind of a little bit of a blue-purple cast, and we're just trying to get rid of that. I'm pretty happy with that there. Another tip, if you hold Control and then 0, or on Mac you hold Command 0, it will just automatically zoom your image to be full size in the Photoshop program. And the last layer that we can add, so into layer again, new adjustment layer, and hue/saturation. This is something you don't have to add, but you could maybe take a look at to see if it will improve your image. Here, I think I could use just a little boost in saturation. I don't want to go crazy with this. I also don't want my image to be black and white. Try to keep your adjustment in plus or minus 20. So here, if I go all the way to 20, that's a pretty saturated image. It's a little bit too much. But if I wanted to desaturate, I could go to negative 20 and it would give some nice desaturation effect as well. I'm just looking for something just a little bit more saturated, so I'm going to use plus 12. We can uncheck that and check it again. And I would call this image pretty well edited just as a basic start. If we click and then drag up on all the little eyeballs, we can get rid of all of those adjustments just to see it before and then after. And I'm pretty happy with this. Next, we're going to move on and do the same things to all of our other images. A helpful tip, if you are editing images that are very similar, say I took, a bunch of images of this same exact scene, maybe from different areas, or I was taking portraits that were all in the same lighting, I can select any one or a group of these layers and drag them over to my next image. So I can drag this levels adjustment and then hold and click and then hold it over top of this one for a second and then drag it down here and then let go. And it will automatically give me that layer adjustment on our next image. Now that doesn't really do us a whole lot of good in this instance because we need to adjust it again. But we could do that with all of our layers. So I can hold shift and then select all of these, drag all 3 of them over to the next image and then let go. And it will apply all 3 of those. So now I can just kind of go from where we are right now. I can quickly edit these. I don't want my highlights to be too bright, so I'm just going to go until this looks pretty bright. And then I will drag this back down to here, maybe adjust until it's a little bit darker. Then I can bring my midtones back. I don't want them too dark. I just want it to look kind of nice and contrasty. That looks good to me. Next, we can look at color balance. The color balance that we did on the last image, I think is pretty close. We can maybe get rid of a little bit of that red, maybe get rid of a little bit of that magenta. But I feel pretty good about how that looks just as a quick edit. You can always go back and edit this more. That looks pretty good to me. Let's see what our saturation layer does. I think plus 12 is a little bit much for this one. So I maybe will just go plus 5. I think that's enough to just bring out a little bit of color. And likewise, we can select all these layers and drag them over to our third image. And that levels adjustment is way too intense. You can see how much we're losing the sky and adding a bit too much contrast. So let's pull that back. I'm okay with the sky being a little overexposed in this instance. But I'm kind of looking at how bright the edge of this little shipping container is. I'm going to go maybe around there. Let's pull it back. I don't want too much shadow. And then let's see where we are around the middle. I'm kind of liking the way that looks there. Let's click it on and off. Yeah, I think that's adding a nice amount of contrast. Maybe it's a little too bright. There we go. Let's take a look at color balance. A little green, so I'm going to bring that down into the magenta a touch. Let's try and warm it up just a little bit. A trick that I like to do sometimes is making one adjustment, like this kind of warming adjustment with the midtones, and then doing the opposite with the shadows can help to add some, like, just a little bit of contrast in the colors, which tends to look pretty nice. That looks pretty good, pretty neutral. I'm not really going to touch the highlights at all because it just starts to get pretty messy when you do that. But that looks good. We're kind of getting rid of this little purple cast. If you want to zoom into your image, make sure you're selected on this main tool up here. Hold Alt on the keyboard and then use the scroll wheel, and it'll let you zoom in and zoom out. If you want to then move around the image when you're zoomed in, just hold down the space bar and you'll see a little hand appear, and then you can click and drag to reposition the image on your screen. All right, I'm going to hold Alt and then zoom out a little bit. Let's look at saturation. Let's turn it on and off from where we are now. Let's see if increasing it a little bit will help things. I'm thinking maybe +8. We don't want too much saturation increase. All right, very good. Now we have all 3 of our images edited and we are ready to export them. So here is the most helpful tip that I can give you in Photoshop when it comes to exporting your images. I am requiring you to export your images as both Photoshop files and as JPEG images. The traditional way to do that for a single image, let's say this one, is we click on File, and then Export as, and this will give us the option to select JPEG for exporting our JPEG image, and we have all these things here, and then we can click Export and then save it. Likewise, if we want to save a Photoshop file, we can go to File and then Save As, and then it will give us the option to export this as a Photoshop file. But there is a better way that I highly recommend. That better way is Scripts Image Processor. So I'm going to go up to File, click on that, go all the way down to Scripts, and then I want to select Image Processor. Now, within Image Processor, we have a bunch of settings. These top 2 can always stay the same. They will be Use Open Images, and then they will be Save in Same Location. So those are both checked. And then in part 3, we want to ensure that we have a couple settings. One, we want to select Save as JPEG. Very good. And we want to make sure that the quality is always 12. Sometimes it'll automatically be set to 5. Always make sure that you set it to 12. That is the highest quality that we can export a JPEG as. And next, we also want to check the Save as PSD little checkbox so that we are saving our files as both Save as JPEG and Save as PSD. This can be checked, maximize compatibility can be checked, and you don't need to resize to fit at all. Great, so what this is going to do when I click Run, it is going to go through all of my images as it saves, and it is going to automatically save all 3 of these open files as a JPEG and as a Photoshop file. So it'll do all the work for me. If I minimize Photoshop, and minimize Bridge. So let's go back to our folder we made at the beginning. That's where we've been working. Let's double click there and look at our landscape folder. You'll see our original files are all still here, including that panorama that we made, but you will also see 2 new folders that have popped up. If I click on the JPEG one, you can see that these are all of my saved and exported JPEGs. That we just exported out of Photoshop, all done and ready. And likewise, we also have a Photoshop file folder as well. A thing to note is how big a Photoshop file is. You can see here that our first image is 129 megabytes versus the original image, which is 34 megabytes for our raw file, and our compressed JPEG is only 12 megabytes. So be sure to use a relatively big, hard drive or USB drive or something to save all these. I still recommend working entirely from the desktop. And then at the end, our last step would be to save this file, our whole folder, or just the specific project folder, and save that, copy and paste it onto our USB or thumb drive so that we can have that on our own. If you would like to log into Google Drive or some other cloud service on the computer and then upload your files to that, that also works as well. So that is the basics of getting your files from your SD card and putting them onto a folder on your computer, selecting only the ones that you want, then opening something like a Panorama or your regular images into Camera Raw, then importing those into Photoshop, making sure you add your levels, color balance, and hue saturation layers, and then exporting them all using Script's image processor. A really important thing is that you want to always use layers. I am expecting to see all of these layers. If I close all, and I have already saved them, so I don't need to worry about saving changes. If I open up all 3 of these Photoshop files again, or just this one, you can see that it retains all of that info from the color balance, saturation, and levels layers, and they're all still editable infinitely. That's what I need to see, because we are trying to do what is called non-destructive editing. We don't want to ever have the option of baking in these colors or these brightness adjustments directly onto our image. We want to try and preserve the original image as much as possible. So with that being said, that's all that you need to know when it comes to editing the first project.